Judge Coney Barrett mocked Ibrahim Traoré in court, but his legal knowledge left everyone stunned. "Stand when I address you, Mr. Traoré," Judge Coney Barrett declared with an icy tone. Yet, the young man named Ibrahim Traoré remained still. Not a single unnecessary movement, his gaze calm yet profound, meeting the cold, contemptuous look from the judge's bench head-on. In a room heavy with prejudice about youth, background, and skin color, no one expected that this seemingly disadvantaged man possessed an astonishing depth of legal knowledge and razor-sharp eloquence that, in just a few short minutes, left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew thick with an almost absolute silence. International delegations, high-level diplomats, and journalists from renowned global news agencies closely observed every gesture, every word exchanged in this historic hearing. Ibrahim Traoré, the sitting president of Burkina Faso, faced grave accusations. The case wasn't just about violating democratic principles following the military uprising that brought him to power, but had escalated into charges of crimes against humanity and war crimes. In particular, the bloody attack on a humanitarian aid convoy from the US-based organization Beacon of Relief, which killed 3 American citizens, became a pivotal point, prompting intervention and pressure from the international community. Traoré's presence at this trial was a rare event. He had voluntarily accepted the international court's summons to directly confront the criticisms and wave of international sanctions threatening his country. Judge Coney Barrett, a seasoned member of the U.S. Supreme Court, known for her conservative stance and at times uncompromising demeanor, looked down at the young African leader with a clear air of superiority. To Judge Barrett, as well as many in the room, Traoré was just another military figure in a long list of leaders who seized power by force, a pattern deeply etched into the turbulent political history of the African continent. But what they failed to grasp was the complex reality behind his calm exterior. A man who had studied geology, participated in international peacekeeping missions, and relentlessly fought brutal terrorist groups in his country before shouldering the responsibility of leading the nation. "We are here to address the serious allegations against you," Judge Barrett continued, adjusting her glasses with a deliberate air of formality. "A military uprising, the suspension of fundamental constitutional rights, and now the intent to prolong your time in power, delaying the democratic transition. Do you have any defense for these actions?" Ibrahim Traoré slowly stood, carrying himself with pride and unwavering resolve. Though only in his 30s, his eyes conveyed a seasoned depth, forged in the fierce battles against extremist insurgent groups and in the lecture halls of the University of Ouagadougou, where he had been an active member of progressive student movements. He was not the uneducated military officer many mistakenly assumed him to be. "With all due respect, honorable members of the panel," Traoré began, his voice maintaining an astonishing calm yet resolute tone. "Before delving into your allegations, allow me to ask a question. Do you truly understand the reality of Burkina Faso? Have you ever set foot in the villages of my country's north, ravaged by terrorism, to witness it firsthand? Have you ever seen mothers who lost their children in attacks that our previous governments were utterly powerless to prevent?" A murmur rippled through the room. Judge Barrett, visibly irritated by the boldness of the defendant's question, sharply struck her gavel to restore order. "We are not here to discuss geography or tourism, Mr. Traoré. We are evaluating your actions, not your country's landscape," she retorted with a mocking tone, eliciting a few dry chuckles from the audience. Traore's defense attorney, Miss Ilara Vance, a renowned international human rights lawyer from Harmony Creek, immediately stood, her expression resolute. Your Honor, my client is providing essential political context for his actions, which is critical to understanding the extraordinary circumstances that led to the decisions being explained here, she interjected firmly. Judge Barrett waved her hand dismissively. Proceed, but I warn you, I will not tolerate any political propaganda speeches in this courtroom. Ibrahim nodded respectfully and continued, his calm demeanor starkly contrasting the tense atmosphere. In my country, over 2 million people have been internally displaced due to terrorist violence. Nearly 60% of our territory is under the influence or control of armed groups. When I assumed power, it was because the previous government had utterly failed to protect our people. It was not personal ambition, but a national necessity. Judge Coney Barrett interrupted with clear disdain. All coup leaders say that, sir. National necessity, saving the people, no time for democratic elections like any other civilized nation. Ibrahim Traoré gave a slight smile before responding. Elections, Your Honor. How can you hold elections when entire regions are too dangerous for even election officials to enter without fear of kidnapping or assassination? Democracy is not just about casting ballots, it is first about ensuring the security and dignity of citizens placed to dumb. The silence in the room deepened. Some journalists scribbled furiously, taken aback by the young president's eloquence and resolve. Before continuing my testimony, I'd like to share this with those watching from home, Traore said, looking directly into the cameras. If you also believe that every nation has the right to forge its own path to stability and progress, I invite you to leave a comment and share your experiences. Your voices matter in building a fairer and more balanced international dialogue. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that mainstream media often overlooks. Judge Barrett struck her gavel forcefully. This is not a television show, Mr. Traore. Focus on addressing the allegations. I am doing exactly that, Your Honor, Ibrahim replied, catching the judge slightly off guard. But to understand my actions, you must understand the context. Allow me to explain how a university-educated geologist became the leader of a nation in crisis. The courtroom remained silent as Ibrahim Traoré began to recount his story. Born in a small, remote rural town in a forgotten province, Traoré grew up in Burkina Faso, struggling to find its identity after years of political instability. The son of humble farmers, he displayed sharp intelligence and unwavering determination from a young age, earning a scholarship to study in the capital. I graduated with a degree in geology from the University of Ouagadougou, he explained clearly. There, I didn't just learn about my country's mineral wealth, but also about the richness of our ideas. I was an active member of the Burkina National Students Association, where we debated how to build a truly sovereign nation. Judge Barrett gave a wry smile. A socialist student association, I presume. I see where your revolutionary ideas come from. Ibrahim met the judge's gaze without flinching. Critical thinking is not exclusive to any ideology, Your Honor. In those lecture halls, we learned to question an international system that has kept Africa in perpetual dependence, but we also learned about responsibility and service. With meticulous precision, Traoré recounted how he decided to join the armed forces that same year, graduating with honors from the General West Point Military Academy. Former classmates remembered him as a disciplined, studious cadet, with a particular focus on the security issues beginning to plague the Sahel region. Soon after, I was deployed on a United Nations peacekeeping mission in Mali, Traoré continued. There, I witnessed firsthand how terrorism spread across the Sahel like an uncontrollable fire. While we built schools, terrorists destroyed them. While we distributed aid, they looted and killed. While we tried to bring hope, they sowed fear and despair. Traoré's voice grew heavier, each word carrying the weight of what he had seen. We saw international peacekeeping missions, though well-intentioned, often hamstrung by complex rules and insufficient resources to effectively counter the growing threat. He paused briefly, his gaze sweeping across the faces in the room, as if willing each person to understand the burden he and his country bore. After those missions, I returned to Burkina Faso and directly engaged in the fight against terrorism. I fought alongside brave soldiers who often lacked proper equipment, modern weapons, and even food. We faced enemies who were better trained, better armed, and had no moral boundaries. We repeatedly requested more effective support from international partners, but responses were often delayed, inadequate, or came with conditions that we felt undermined our sovereignty. The previous government, despite its efforts, failed to protect civilians. Attacks on schools, hospitals, and markets became a daily terror. Traore paused, his eyes shifting to the dossier before Judge Barrett, then meeting her gaze directly. And in particular, Your Honor, we cannot overlook the bloody attack on the Beacon of Relief humanitarian convoy. 3 American citizens were brutally killed on our soil while trying to bring hope and sustenance to those in need. That horrific event was not only a personal tragedy, but also the clearest evidence of the previous government's inability to protect even foreign aid workers, let alone its own people. This incident sparked international outrage and is one of the key reasons for the pressure we face today. The desperation of our people grew, Traore continued, his voice now tinged with sorrow but still resolute. They lost faith in the government, the military, and even the promises of the international community. Hundreds of thousands were forced to flee their homes, living in deprivation with no future. Schools closed, hospitals were overwhelmed, and the economy collapsed. That is why we had to act, he emphasized, looking directly at Judge Barrett. The military uprising was not a reckless act or personal ambition. It was the cry of a nation drowning in violence and neglect. We could not stand by and watch our country disintegrate. We could not wait for theoretical solutions from afar while our people died every day. Regarding the suspension of the Constitution and the extension of the transitional government, Traore said, we were forced to take those measures to restore order, rebuild the military, and establish a solid foundation for a true, sustainable democracy. How could we hold fair, free elections when over half our territory remains under threat and millions of citizens cannot safely vote? We are not rejecting democracy, Your Honor. We are fighting to create the conditions for democracy to exist and thrive. We are doing everything possible to strengthen security, restore public services, and prepare for a meaningful election where every Burkinabe can exercise their rights without fear. It is a complex and challenging process, but we are committed to that path. We seek partners willing to support us not just with words, but with concrete actions, without conditions that harm our national sovereignty. Traore concluded his statement, and a heavy silence enveloped the room. His words seemed to have moved some of those present, though Judge Barrett maintained her stern expression. The young president, once underestimated, had left a profound impression of resilience and vision, far surpassing initial prejudices. Judge Barrett, who had initially taken notes with an air of indifference, looked up in surprise when Traore mentioned his involvement in Operation Dawn's Light in 2019, a major offensive against terrorist groups in northern Burkina Faso. In that operation, Ibrahim recounted, his eyes briefly lost in painful memories. We lost many comrades, close friends, both men and women, who sacrificed their lives to protect villages barely found on maps, villages that international powers only remember when there are natural resources to exploit. A murmur ran through the room. Some representatives from Western nations shifted uncomfortably in their seats. During those years of direct combat, he continued, I saw advanced weapons reach terrorists while our soldiers lacked basic equipment. I saw how some foreign powers played a double game in the region, publicly condemning terrorism while their companies continued to extract gold and other minerals from unstable areas, exacerbating conflicts. Miss Ilara Vance, Traore's defense attorney, sat upright, her gaze resolute. Suddenly, Prosecutor Julian Hayes, a sharp-witted lawyer from the U.S. Department of Justice, stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is making baseless accusations against nations not on trial here." Judge Barrett nodded. "Objection sustained, Mr. Traoré. Stick to the facts relevant to your case." Ibrahim bowed slightly in compliance. "The facts, Your Honor, are that at the time, Burkina Faso was on the brink of collapse. Our territory was beyond state control. Thousands of schools had closed. Hundreds of thousands had fled their homes, and meanwhile, our government seemed more concerned with pleasing former colonial powers than protecting its own people." With military precision, Traoré described the events leading to the uprising that ousted President Paul Henry Sandaogo Damiba, who, ironically, had also seized power through a coup just 8 months prior. "We did not act out of personal ambition," he stressed with conviction. "We did so because the people of Burkina Faso deserve a government that prioritizes their security and sovereignty, one unafraid to seek new international alliances if it means better equipping our armed forces and strengthening our fight against terrorism." Judge Barrett, who until then had shown only veiled disdain, now listened with growing attention. The young president's eloquence, command of facts, and restrained passion in recounting his country's plight began to create an unexpected effect in the room. "After becoming interim president," Ibrahim continued, "we established the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration. Our goal, of course, was to restore territorial security, reclaim areas occupied by terrorists, and pave the way for a true national revival." He detailed the reforms implemented: reorganizing the military, investing in equipment, promoting officers based on merit rather than political connections, and, crucially, diversifying international alliances. "We decided that Burkina Faso would no longer be the backyard of any global power," he declared firmly. "We established ties with Russia, China, Turkey, and other nations willing to treat us as equals, not subjects." In September 2023, alongside Mali and Niger, we formed the Alliance of States for a Common Defense to combat terrorism and achieve greater regional autonomy. Judge Amy Coney Barrett, now visibly more attentive, interjected. "Yet, Mr. Traoré, you recently extended your government by 5 years. Does this not contradict the democratic intentions you've outlined?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The room held its breath, waiting to see how the young president would respond to this direct accusation. Ibrahim Traoré met the judge's gaze without hesitation. "Your Honor, democracy is not a luxury a nation engulfed in flames can afford. It is a goal we fight for every day. But before voting, our citizens need to sleep without fear of their villages being attacked in the dead of night. Extending the transitional government was not an arbitrary decision, but a widely recognized necessity." The atmosphere in the courtroom had subtly shifted. The initial murmurs of disdain had transformed into a focused silence. Ibrahim Traoré, the young military man whom many had hastily judged as a mere coup leader, was demonstrating a profound understanding of regional and global geopolitics, astonishing even his critics. "With the court's permission," Ibrahim said as his lawyer, Ilara Vance, handed a dossier to the tribunal. "These are security reports documenting the progress in our country. Since we took power, in the areas we've regained control of, schools have reopened. Markets are functioning normally, and life is gradually returning to normal." Judge Barrett meticulously reviewed the documents, frowning as she saw photographs of rebuilt schools, restored health posts, and communities celebrating their return home after years of forced displacement. These achievements are impressive, Mr. Traoré, the judge finally acknowledged, her tone noticeably less hostile. But according to reports from international organizations, your government has also restricted civil liberties and suppressed political opponents. Ibrahim nodded gravely. Security always demands a difficult balance, Your Honor. We've had to act decisively against those who, under the guise of political activity, collaborated with terrorist groups or foreign powers intent on destabilizing our country. We're not proud of every measure taken, but we are proud of the results. Thousands of lives have been saved. Prosecutor Julian Hayes, clearly unsettled by the direction of the trial, stood abruptly. Your Honor, the defendant is justifying systematic human rights violations under the pretext of national security. It's the same excuse used by every dictator in history. Ibrahim Traoré's eyes blazed with intensity at the accusation. When he spoke, his voice resonated through the room with a calm but unshakable strength. No human rights violation is greater than abandoning a people to terrorists who behead teachers for teaching science, kidnap girls to enslave them, and massacre entire villages for refusing to follow their extremist religious interpretations, he declared. When Europe faces terrorist threats, no one questions their tightened security measures. When the United States suffers a single attack, they launch wars that destabilize entire regions. But when African nations protect their people, we're labeled as dictators. A deathly silence enveloped the room. Judge Barrett, who had begun the day with an attitude of disdain toward the young president, now looked at him with a mix of surprise and reluctant respect. "Mr. Traoré," the judge finally said, "you speak with great passion, but the international alliances your government has forged with countries like Russia raise deep concerns in the international community. Are you not afraid that these new dependencies will create as many problems as the old ones?" Ibrahim gave a slight smile before responding. "True independence, Your Honor, is not about isolating ourselves from the world, but having the freedom to choose whom to partner with based on national interests, not external impositions. For decades, our options were limited to dealing with former colonial powers on unequal terms. Today, we diversify our alliances to achieve what our people need: security, development, and respect for our sovereignty." With meticulous precision, Traoré detailed the agreements reached with various countries. Military cooperation with Russia to combat terrorism, infrastructure projects with China, agricultural partnerships with Turkey, educational exchanges with Cuba. Each agreement, he explained, was designed to build national capacity, not create new dependencies. Unlike IMF loans, which impose austerity policies that strangle our economy, these new partnerships respect our national priorities. Judge Barrett, now visibly engaged, leaned forward. "Yet, Mr. Traoré, many fear that the Sahel alliance you formed with Mali and Niger will become a bloc hostile to the West." Ibrahim shook his head. "We are not hostile to anyone, Your Honor. We simply refuse to be pawns in others' geopolitical games. This alliance was born out of a specific need, to collectively confront cross-border threats that no single nation among us could face alone. It is not against any country or bloc, but for the benefit of our people." With eloquence, the young president explained how this regional alliance enabled coordinated military operations against terrorist groups moving across the Sahel's vulnerable borders, sharing critical intelligence and optimizing scarce resources. "It's curious," he said with a wry smile, "when European nations unite in NATO, it's praised as international cooperation. But when African nations form similar alliances, we're met with suspicion and hostility." A murmur of agreement rose from the public gallery, where representatives from several African and Global South nations nodded. Judge Barrett, sensing the impact of Traoré's words, tried to steer the questioning back to the core issue. Let's return to specific facts, Mr. Traore. Can you explain why, after initially promising a swift return to constitutional order, you've now extended your term by 5 years? The question was direct, an attempt to corner the young president. But Ibrahim Traoré, rather than appearing rattled, seemed grateful for the opportunity to clarify this critical point. When we assumed power, he responded candidly, we inherited a country on the brink of collapse. The economy was devastated, institutions were paralyzed. We promised to restore security and create conditions for a genuine democratic transition, not merely hold paper elections amid chaotic security and social conditions. A vote in such circumstances would not reflect the true will of the people but would be a farce, a legitimization of instability. Ibrahim Traoré paused, his gaze resolute. Our task is not just to clear the rubble, but to build a solid foundation for democracy to truly take root. That requires time. Time to rebuild the military, equip and train them to protect every inch of our land. Time for schools to reopen, for millions of displaced people to return home and rebuild their lives. Time to restore basic public services, to rebuild trust between the government and the people. He looked directly at Judge Barrett, who was listening intently. We've consulted widely with all sectors of society, from community leaders, religious figures, civil society organizations, to the armed forces and youth. The decision to extend the transition was not mine alone, but the result of a broad national consensus, based on a shared recognition of the harsh realities we face. They understand that rushing would only lead to failure, plunging the country into a new cycle of instability. Our ultimate goal remains to hold free, fair, and transparent elections, Traoré emphasized, but we will do so when every citizen of Burkina Faso, whether in the remotest village or the busiest city, can exercise their civic rights safely and meaningfully. We don't want a hollow democracy where people vote in fear or because they have no other choice but terrorists. Our transition plan includes specific timelines for strengthening security, restoring basic services, and building institutional capacity. We are working tirelessly to meet those milestones. Every day, we see progress, however small, but these are solid steps on the path to recovery. He concluded with a powerful question. Would you have us rush into a hasty election to satisfy external standards while our country is still torn apart by violence and chaos? Or would you have us build a true peace, a lasting security, and a robust democracy from the ground up, even if that process takes a little longer? Elections, he concluded with conviction, are not an end in themselves, but a means to ensure the people's representation. Holding them hastily in an insecure context without necessary reforms would betray the trust our people have placed in us. Judge Coney Barrett removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, clearly affected by the intensity of the testimony. When she looked back at Ibrahim Traoré, her expression had changed. Gone was the initial arrogance and disdain. Instead, there was a complex mix of reluctant respect and professional unease. Mr. Traoré, she finally said, I must admit your arguments carry more weight than I anticipated. However, this court is duty-bound to evaluate your actions against international standards of democratic governance. Ibrahim nodded calmly. I understand completely, Your Honor, but allow me to ask a question. Are these standards truly universal, or do they primarily reflect the specific historical experiences of Western nations? A tense silence filled the room. The young president stood, his lean but steady frame exuding an undeniable dignity. Western democracies, he continued, evolved over centuries, often through violent and conflicted processes. They had the privilege of time and, it must be said, colonial exploitation that funded their stability. We, however, are expected to condense that process into mere years while facing existential threats and the consequences of centuries of plunder. Prosecutor Julian Hayes moved to interrupt, but Judge Barrett, with a surprising gesture, signaled for Traore to continue. "I do not reject democracy, Your Honor," Ibrahim emphasized with restrained passion. "On the contrary, I fight to create the conditions for a genuine and sustainable democracy to thrive in my country. A democracy that responds to our realities, not a superficial imitation of external models that, if applied too soon, could exacerbate our problems rather than solve them." With meticulous precision, Traore outlined the institutional reforms his government had implemented. Establishing local development councils with direct citizen participation, reorganizing the judicial system to make it more accessible to rural populations, reintegration programs for youth recruited by extremist groups, and initiatives to revive local economies and reduce dependence on foreign aid. "These reforms," he explained, "lay the foundation for a democracy rooted in our people's actual needs, not in abstract expectations imposed from outside. A democracy that ensures not just formal political rights but also physical security, economic dignity, and national sovereignty." Judge Barrett, who had been taking notes with increasing interest, looked up and asked the question many in the room were silently pondering. "What assurances, Mr. Traore, can you provide that this extended transition will not turn into a dictatorship or authoritarian regime, exploiting security as a pretext to hold power indefinitely?" Judge Barrett's question was direct and incisive, reflecting the international community's core concern. Ibrahim Traoré met the judge's gaze without flinching, his expression retaining its characteristic calm, but his eyes burning with steely resolve. "Your Honor, I understand that concern. Africa's history is replete with leaders who rose to power promising stability but clung to it in the end. However, we are different. We are not ambitious politicians, but soldiers who have seen our country's devastation and are determined to do whatever it takes to restore it." He continued, his voice resonating through the hall, commanding the room's full attention. "First, our commitment to the democratic transition is not mere rhetoric. It is reflected in clear timelines in the National Transition Charter, though we've had to adjust deadlines for security reasons. We are taking concrete steps to prepare for elections, conducting a census, updating voter rolls, and establishing independent commissions to oversee the entire process. Second, the oversight of our people. We've established mechanisms for citizens to hold the government accountable. Local development councils, where citizens directly participate in decision-making, are one example. We've also increased transparency in public spending and combated corruption because we believe an accountable government is the foundation of a healthy democracy. Third, pressure from our own armed forces and regional partners. Burkina Faso's armed forces are not a monolithic entity loyal to one individual. There are countless other officers and soldiers who have sacrificed for the country, and they too desire a return to constitutional order. The Sahel Alliance also serves as a stabilizing factor, promoting good governance and accountability among its members. And finally, Traore said, his gaze fixed on Judge Barrett, "The real needs of our people are the greatest assurance. The people of Burkina Faso are weary of war and instability. They yearn for peace, security, and a better future. If we fail to deliver those, we will fail, and other forces not out of ambition, but out of urgency will rise again. We do not want that scenario to repeat." He stood tall, exuding confidence. "We do not seek blind approval, Your Honor. We seek understanding and tangible support. We believe that once security is under control, institutions are strengthened, and our people feel safe and empowered, a strong and independent democracy will naturally emerge in Burkina Faso. That is our promise, and that is the future we are building with our own blood and sweat." The silence in the room was profound, not one of skepticism but of reflection. Judge Barrett, who had heard many significant cases in her career, was visibly moved by Traore's testimony. Her once cold demeanor was gone, and in her eyes one could see recognition of the young president's resolve and determination. The judge gently tapped her gavel, concluding the remarkable questioning. "Mr. Traore, we have listened carefully to your testimony. The court will consider the arguments and evidence presented. The trial will be adjourned. We will announce our decision and next steps at the earliest opportunity." Ibrahim Traoré nodded, his expression remaining calm and resolute. He turned and walked away, under the gaze of hundreds of watching eyes. In the crowded hallway filled with reporters and diplomats, a new debate seemed to have begun. This trial was not just about Ibrahim Traoré. It was about a bold call for justice, for nations' self-determination, and for the true meaning of democracy in a turbulent world. "The best assurances," Ibrahim said, "are the tangible results our people can see and feel. Every school reopened in areas once controlled by terrorists, every family returning home after years of displacement. Every young person finding opportunities in their homeland instead of risking their lives crossing the Mediterranean." A profound silence fell as Ibrahim pulled a small object from his pocket and held it up for all to see. "This," he said, "is a piece of mineral extracted from our country's mines. For decades, our mineral wealth left Burkina Faso, bringing immense profits to foreign corporations while our people remained mired in poverty. Today, we are renegotiating every mining contract to ensure these resources first benefit their rightful owners, the people of Burkina Faso." With eloquence, he explained how reforms in the mining sector had significantly increased state revenue, enabling funding for development projects without complete reliance on foreign aid or conditional loans. True independence, he emphasized, begins with economic sovereignty. Without it, democracy becomes an empty exercise where citizens elect representatives with no real power to change their living conditions. Judge Coney Barrett, clearly impressed by the coherence and depth of the argument, nodded slowly. "Your points certainly merit consideration, Mr. Traoré. But this court must also weigh the allegations of restricted press freedom and suppression of political opponents." Ibrahim did not shy away from the question. "In a state of warrant, we are facing a war against terrorism. Complex ethical issues arise. We've had to act against media outlets and individuals who, under the guise of journalism or political opposition, collaborated with groups seeking to destroy our state. I don't claim every decision was perfect, but all were guided by the necessity to protect our people." With candor, he acknowledged mistakes and overreaches, but also detailed the oversight mechanisms implemented to prevent systematic abuses. Citizen oversight committees, hotlines to report security force misconduct, and human rights training programs for soldiers. "Our goal," he concluded with resolve, "is not to hold power indefinitely, but to build a strong state capable of ensuring security, development, and dignity for all its citizens. When we achieve these fundamental goals, we will proudly hand over power to democratically elected leaders, but doing so too soon, leaving a weak state vulnerable to new crises, would betray the trust placed in us." The silence following those words was profound. Even those who came to the court with firm prejudices against the young president were now reconsidering their stance. Judge Coney Barrett, after briefly conferring with her colleagues, made an unprecedented decision. "This court," she declared, "will temporarily suspend its ruling to conduct a fact-finding visit to Burkina Faso. We deem it essential to verify firsthand the conditions President Traore has described before issuing a final judgment." A murmur of surprise rippled through the hall. Ibrahim Traoré, as calm as ever, simply nodded in gratitude. "My country," he said with solemnity, "will welcome this court with all honor. We will show you both our achievements and the challenges that remain. We do not ask to be judged by different standards, but to be understood in the specific context in which we act. 3 weeks later, the court reconvened after a remarkable fact-finding visit to Burkina Faso. The judges had traveled across regions reclaimed from terrorist control, spoken with ordinary citizens, visited reconstruction projects, and held meetings with various segments of Burkinabe society, from traditional leaders to young activists, from entrepreneurs to subsistence farmers. The courtroom was now packed. Representatives from numerous African and global South nations were present to witness a ruling many considered historic, not just for Burkina Faso, but for how the international community evaluates political transitions in contexts of profound crisis. Judge Coney Barrett, whose initial disdain for Ibrahim Traoré had visibly softened after hearing his testimony and visiting his country, prepared to deliver the ruling. Her face, typically impassive, now reflected the complexity of the case she had to judge. "This court," she began with a formal tone, "has had the unique opportunity to not only review documents and testimony, but also the specific realities of a nation facing existential challenges. What we saw in Burkina Faso profoundly altered our understanding of this case." An expectant silence filled the room as the judge continued. "We have personally verified the severity of the terrorist threat this country faces. We have witnessed significant security progress under the current government. We have heard first-hand accounts from citizens who can now return home after years of forced displacement." The judge paused, adjusting her glasses before continuing. "However, we have also noted restrictions on fundamental freedoms that, under normal circumstances, would be unacceptable in a democratic state. The core question this court must address is whether those extraordinary measures are justified by the equally extraordinary context in which they were applied." Ibrahim Traoré remained composed, his eyes fixed on the judge. At 36, the young president had not only shifted international perceptions of his government, but also reframed the terms of the debate about governance in crisis situations. "After careful consideration," Judge Barrett continued, "this court has reached the following conclusion. While President Traoré's government came to power through unconstitutional means, its subsequent actions have been primarily guided by the imperative to protect the people of Burkina Faso from grave and immediate threats, thereby fulfilling the fundamental responsibility of any state." A gasp of astonishment spread through the room. No one expected such a nuanced ruling from a court often known for applying rigid standards and ignoring context. "Therefore," the judge continued, "this court does not condemn the actions of Burkina Faso's transitional government. Instead, we establish a monitoring mechanism to periodically assess progress toward fully restoring constitutional order, recognizing that this process must adapt to the country's specific realities rather than externally imposed artificial deadlines." Ibrahim Traoré stood, his face reflecting restrained emotion. This was not a personal victory he was celebrating, but an international recognition of the legitimacy of his people's struggle for security, dignity, and true self-determination. "Mr. President," Judge Coney Barrett said, looking directly at him with a respect that starkly contrasted her initial demeanor, "this court wishes to express our admiration for the eloquence, sincerity, and depth with which you have defended your cause. You have achieved what few can, making us question our own assumptions and reconsider our analytical frameworks." The cameras captured the historic moment. The stern American judge, who had begun by mocking the young African leader, now extended her hand to shake his with genuine respect. That image would become a symbol of a potential new paradigm in international relations, one based on rejecting imposed uniform models and recognizing the diversity of paths toward shared goals. As he left the courtroom, Ibrahim was greeted by an enthusiastic crowd. Journalists from around the world jostled to get his first remarks following the historic ruling. "This is not my personal victory," he affirmed with his characteristic humility. This is a victory for the entire people of Burkina Faso, for the Sahel, and for all nations struggling to shape their own destiny in the face of existential challenges. A journalist asked whether he believed the ruling legitimized his continued rule for another 5 years. His response reflected the clarity of thought that had impressed the court. The ruling does not legitimize individuals or specific timelines. It legitimizes the principle that every nation has the right to find its own path to stability and development, taking into account its unique circumstances. Our commitment remains unchanged: to create the conditions for a genuine and sustainable democracy in Burkina Faso. In the days that followed, international analysts noted that the Traore case could mark a turning point in how the international community approaches similar situations in other nations. The term Traore doctrine began circulating in diplomatic circles, referring to the recognition that democracy is not a singular, immutable model, but a process adaptable to diverse historical and cultural contexts. For Ibrahim, however, the challenges remained immense. Back in Ouagadougou, he immediately convened his cabinet to continue the fight against terrorism, strengthen state institutions, and develop the national economy. International recognition was significant, but the true measure of his success remained the tangible prosperity of the millions of Burkinabe who had placed their trust in him. Months later, regions reclaimed from terrorist control were flourishing again. Schools, markets, and health centers operated normally. Families who had lived for years as internally displaced returned home. The economy showed signs of recovery, driven by mining sector reforms and new international agreements, prioritizing mutual benefit over unilateral exploitation. The case of Ibrahim Traoré reminds us that history rarely moves in a straight line, that the path to freedom, security, and dignity is as diverse as the peoples who walk it. Most importantly, it shows that those initially judged with contempt can ultimately teach us profound lessons about justice, sovereignty, and true democracy. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and the trial offers valuable lessons for life in the United States. We often judge things by preconceived standards, as Judge Coney Barrett initially viewed Traoré. But reality is far more complex. In the United States, we debate the balance between freedom and security, as well as the role of government in protecting citizens. Just as Burkina Faso faces terrorism, the U.S. grapples with issues like gun violence or political division. Traoré's words that democracy is not a luxury a nation engulfed in flames can afford prompt us to reflect on our willingness to sacrifice freedoms for security, or vice versa. The attack on the Beacon of Relief convoy, which claimed the lives of 3 American citizens, starkly illustrates the consequences of a government's inability to protect civilians. It underscores the need for decisive action, even if it requires extraordinary measures in extraordinary contexts. Traoré also emphasized economic sovereignty through control of resources. This reminds us in the U.S. that economic decisions must prioritize the people's interests, not be dictated by corporations or private gain. His renegotiation of mining contracts to ensure resources first benefit the people of Burkina Faso is a powerful reminder to prioritize citizens' welfare. The openness and willingness to reconsider one's own biases. Democracy is not a rigid model but a flexible process that must adapt to circumstances. In our debates, rather than rushing to judgment, we should listen with understanding and seek practical solutions for the common good. If the story of Ibrahim Traoré and the lessons from Burkina Faso have resonated with you, don't hesitate to subscribe to our channel to stay updated with more insightful perspectives and inspiring stories. Thank you for joining us in exploring new definitions of justice and democracy, and we look forward to seeing you in our upcoming content.